The government of Canada wants to control more of the content that you see online. Here to chat with us about it is Jay Goldberg. He's the Ontario Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And he recently wrote a really excellent column on this that I think really helps break down the issue. So Jay's going to chat with us for a few minutes today about it. Jay, thanks for taking a few minutes to talk about C-11, the government's new legislation.
You bet. It's great to be with you, Colin.
So let's start at the top here. What is C-11? What is it that the government is broadly trying to accomplish with this bill?
So with Bill C-11, the government claims that it's trying to bring some of the Canadian content rules that we already see with TV and radio to the internet. So the government says that the goal of their bill is to make Canadian content more accessible, to make Canadian content more prominent, and to try to, improve the fortunes of Canadian artists. In reality, what the bill does, and we can get into this further on, is that actually it's going to be very detrimental to Canadian artists. It's going to be very difficult for them. And at the same time, it has the building blocks in there to get to a place where you could see the government censoring, not just based on whether or not something counts as Canadian, filtering, but as well based on any other future criteria that they're interested in, such as social cohesion, we've heard brought up, or even even whether or not you're advocating in favor of the government's policies or not.
So, as you mentioned, the government already has this power at the CRTC through radio, TV. Um, what is the problem? Like, have they identified that there's an actual problem? If I want to find content that's related to a particular Canadian matter, or maybe from a Canadian artist or whatever, I can easily find it on social media, on YouTube. You know, you go on Instagram and you scroll and you can see these videos that pop up and they're of the Rockies or wherever. I mean, you're seeing that Canadian content. You see musical artists. I used to work with your group, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and you search on a particular topic, maybe it's the carbon tax, whatever, and up pops a video from the CTF. Have they demonstrated that there's a problem that that kind of thing isn't happening?
They really haven't done that sufficiently, and actually, just recently, the Canadian representative for YouTube was testifying before the Senate committee on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And she was saying, actually, this is going to make Canadian content less accessible. This is going to be detrimental to Canadian artists and Canadians who are trying to spread their stories. So, I trust the people at YouTube who are the ones who, see all these stories get out to the world, as opposed to the government. And, what the government's saying that they're just trying to promote Canadian content. The actual people with the full knowledge of what's going on and the knowledge of the industry are saying it's going to be detrimental. We even had Tesher, who's an Indian Canadian artist out of Regina, writing a column in the Regina Leader Post and said, he was discovered basically halfway around the world, originally from posting videos online, and only later did he become popular in Canada and find success here.
Mm.
So that's the kind of thing that's going to be stopped if Bill C-11's put into law. So not only has the government not outlined a very good rationale, the rationale that they have outlined, it's been completely debunked by people with YouTube and TikTok and other places.
Okay, so I want to ask you about two things there. One, people will be affected when they're scrolling on YouTube or Netflix or whatever. But first, let's just talk about the platforms that are affected. You've
Sure.
mentioned Netflix. We've talked about YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Are they all part of this or covered
Yeah,
by this?
anything that has any kind of audiovisual content online is going to be affected. So obviously YouTube is one of the biggest players, TikTok is as well, and it's going to influence what comes up in your feed because the government of Canada through the CRTC is going to be instructing places like YouTube, like TikTok, to create algorithms so that Canadian content shows up first. The
Mhm.
problem with that, as YouTube has said, is that if you're on YouTube and you're looking at and you're doing a search and Canadian content's being pushed on you, if you don't click on it because you're just not interested in it, YouTube's algorithms take that as a sign that, well, people just don't like this content. They're not interested in it. And so then beyond Canada's borders, the algorithm is saying, this stuff isn't interesting. And so Canadian content gets buried all around the world. And so that's one of the major concerns that people like Tasher and others have really outlined is that it's going to affect our feeds here because we're going to see stuff that we're not interested in. But it's also going to affect feeds abroad, and that's because it's going to be content that people just won't see because it'll be buried.
So if I'm researching, say, let's say I'm in the United States and I'm researching the carbon tax and I'm scrolling through videos on YouTube, if your organization created a video on the carbon tax, it would still be on YouTube. People could go to your page and find it, but what might not happen is it might not show up for me because it's not seen as popular content because of the way that the government is now forcing, say, YouTube to manipulate the rankings. Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, so if the CTF put out a video on the carbon tax here in Canada, it actually would get pushed by the government through these algorithms because it would count as Canadian content, or it might, and we can get to talking about how they figure out what Canadian content is in the first
Right.
place. But yeah, so it would be pushed here, but then it would come into the feeds of people across Canada who aren't interested in the carbon tax, who just aren't interested in the topic, but it's only being pushed on them because it counts as Canadian. So then people won't click on it here in Canada. YouTube takes it as a sign that this is not popular content, that viewers just aren't interested. And then people in the United States who might want to find the CTF content wouldn't be finding it because YouTube's interpreted this as it's just, bad content.
Right. Okay. So let's touch on that point that you just raised about Canadian and how we define things as Canadian. I mean, you and I are chatting right now. We're going to put this video on YouTube. We're both Canadians. But if I was talking to, say, an Irish couple living in Ireland who, recently used some new policy in their healthcare system, and we wanted to talk to them about the experience and learn how it would work and maybe how it might benefit Canadians, is it possible that maybe it wouldn't count as Canadian, even though I'm Canadian, but I'm talking to two people from Ireland, so now suddenly the the majority is Irish,
Well,
doesn't count as Canadian, or
that's kind of an open question. And the way they do it right now, the CRTC, is they look at a bunch of random factors like production, where it was produced, or where the producers who did the production are based. So they've got, Margaret Atwood has wrote The Handmaid's Tale. There's a mini series on it. Of course, it's Canadian content. A lot of it was filmed in the GTA. But because of these outdated rules with the CRTC and the production team not being in Canada, it's not considered to be Canadian. So, again, even though it's a Canadian story, Canadian original author, the CRTC doesn't consider it to be Canadian. So it really is a very open question that, if you are in Canada, but you're interviewing someone who's in another country, it might actually come down to where your video is being produced, where the producers are and how they're processing it and things like that. So that's another clear danger is that they're not focusing on content, which is what you would think you'd want to focus on, like, promoting Canadian content, stuff that talks about Canada with people from Canada. It's really a lot more to do with a bunch of small niche selection criteria and then also production. And so that's a big concern. And it also means that Netflix, which has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Canada, because Netflix isn't based in Canada, any content that's made here for Netflix, even if it's entirely Canadian stories filmed in Canadian cities, it's not going to be considered to fall under that Canadian content criteria. So again, it's a very open question whether you and your Irish interviewees would fall under that category or not.
I love that example that you have in your column. I'm just going to pull it up here, about the Handmaid's Tale. The other one that you've got in here that I thought was really interesting was how there could be a biopic on former US President Donald Trump. It's called Gotta Love Trump, and how that
Mhm.
would be considered Canadian, even though it's about the former US president.
Yeah,
That boggles my mind. And I do love the quote you've got from Professor Michael Geist.
yeah.
I will read that out. He's a University of Ottawa professor. Bill C-11 would give the CRTC the power to set conditions demoting or applying warning labels to content it considers contrary to Broadcasting Act objectives, which are so broad as to cover a wide range of lawful content. It just sounds like the
Mhm.
government's going to get all kinds of power to control what we see on the internet, but yet they haven't really defined the problem that there actually
Right.
is a problem. I like I say, I don't have a problem finding content right now when I go on YouTube, when I go on Netflix, and so forth. But it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in my mind.
No, it really doesn't. And obviously, Canadian content is it's a very broad category, but the government is they're really not doing their homework in the bill that's been created here. Dr. Geis is exactly right in how he describes it. You know, the Bill C-11 was a hastily crafted bill that the Liberals claim that they claim that they've crafted this bill to try to promote Canadian content for the sake of Canadian content. But in reality, what they're doing is they're giving the CRTC the power to filter what we say and see online,
Mhm.
basically to prioritize and therefore inherently deprioritize certain content. Now, they are saying that through a policy directive, they're going to tell the CRTC to filter content only on the basis of Canadianness. So right now, they're only telling the CRTC, rearrange what people are seeing online, but only do it based on Canadianness. And again, as we just spoke about earlier, they
Mhm.
don't really have a very good way of determining what Canadianness is right now. The issue is that the law, as Dr. Geis said, the legislation is so broad that it will actually give the CRTC the power to reorder anything online. It sets up the machine for them to do that. It's only restricting them in regulatory language to focus on Canadianness. But down the line, this could be broadened. So we've had Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino talk in the past about the need to promote more social cohesion here in Canada. So if
Mhm.
that then becomes a policy objective, and then somehow the CRTC is reordering what we see online based on government criteria for something like social cohesion, you can imagine how this gets carried away quite quickly. So it's a very dangerous machine to be setting up. They're saying they're using it for just this one little purpose, but they're setting up the machine and it could be turned on and altered really at any time.
We had actually done a series of a survey and a number of interviews with Canadians who came from socialist and communist countries. And oddly enough, the top concern that they indicated that they had with policies in Canada, we posed this question to them, it was entirely open ended and we didn't know what they were going to say, but their top concern with policies they saw emerging in Canada had to do with curtailing free speech. And that's what this seems to be doing. It's on the surface, it sounds like it's nice and wonderful. They're going to help Canadian content producers, but as you've articulated, there's a number of problems with the actual reality and what this will do. And I can understand why people are getting concerned when you have even just the ability of the government to start curating content, to fixing labels to things,
Mm,
potentially down the road expanding the scope of this to control more and more over what we see. One thing I think about with this is that Canadians don't always want to see Canadian content, right? I mean, when the Super Bowl comes around, what do Canadians want to see? A lot of them want to see the American version
yeah,
or stream because it has more commercials. And of course, it's like a big cultural event when the Super Bowl runs with all the different really new and innovative and catchy and funny and whatever kinds of commercials that are entertaining, that people like watching the commercials almost as much as the game. And they
exactly.
purposely try to get away from the Canadian version because we don't have access to those same ones. So it's a small example, but you also talk in your column about Hulu and how it's already kind of a casualty for Canadian viewers.
Yeah.
Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, so one of the concerns that people have with Bill C-11 is that it's going to create all kinds of complicated guidelines for how broadcasters or online streamers could access the Canadian market. So Hulu has already decided, even without Bill C-11 in place, that entering the Canadian market and following all kinds of rules is just so complicated that they don't even want to bother with it. And so the Canadian market is blocked. So as I said in the column, we can't keep up with the Kardashians anymore because they're on Hulu now. And we're not getting that here in Canada. But this should be a very real concern to people all around the world because, we have tons of Canadians, whether they're immigrants or descended from immigrants or just happen to like shows from elsewhere.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of content coming from South Korea, from the Philippines, from India that
Mhm.
people like to watch here. And well, if Bill C-11 imposes such cumbersome criteria on these streaming services that they just don't want to bother jumping through all the government's hoops, we could end up seeing a lot more streaming services start to block the Canadian market. And so Hulu could be just the beginning. And so that's another big concern that I have and Dr. Geist has shared as well.
Yeah. No, it certainly seems like, and I keep coming back to the fact that I don't see what the problem is right now. Can find this content, like you're saying. I'm sure people that have come from other countries, they're able to get the content that they want. And now you've got the government with this big wrench in its hand. It's looking at throwing it into a whole bunch of different machines that will end up messing things up and causing, I think, more problems than good. Thank you for taking a few minutes to chat about this, Bill. You have written a report on this, and as I mentioned, you've got a column too. If people want to look at either of them, what's your organization's website?
Yeah, just head over to taxpayer.com. You'll be able to see we have an ebook on Bill C-11 and some of the other literature I've written about it. There in the newsroom section, you'll see some more op-eds. We've got some petitions if you want to sign up to stand against Bill C-11. But thank you, Colin, for the opportunity to chat with you about this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jay. It's been very informative.